Hello there. Welcome to the Spellcasting episode. We're back in our learning how to play D&D try that again. We're back in our learning how to play D&D playlist. Ha, there's the right word. I wanted to take just a moment to tell you thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I hope that you learned something today. Oh, and Discord stuff will be ready on Tuesday, so be on the look for that. I'm so excited to start connecting with you all live there on Discord. Yeah, building a community. I think it's going to be a super fun time. So cheers, and let's get into this Thursday's video. Magic in D&D is easily one of my favorite things. Don't get me wrong, at first I was terrified. When I first started playing D&D, I was in 3.5. 5e hadn't come out yet. Actually, I'm pretty sure it came out the year that I started playing D&D, but none of us had the books yet. So anyway, I ended up making that switch when, I started DMing in 3.5 as well because that's what I was more comfortable with, and eventually found out how awesome 5e was, and then our group made the switch. Totally worth it. But even then, spellcasting in 3.5 worked a little differently than it does in 5e. I'm really glad for how they simplified things. And as we get into this, I thought it might be fun to start with just some of the lore of magic and where it comes from, at least in the D&D system. And for those of us joining us in the Player's Handbook, I'm in Chapter 10, aptly titled Spellcasting. So if you want to follow along, that's where a lot of this information is actually coming from. Now, as we get started in understanding what magic is, one of the things that's talked about in some of the lore, also found in this chapter, is referring to what is called the weave. If you want to read more about that in its brief little mention here in the PHB, that's on page 205. Pretty much the way that it defines magic is that raw magic is just the pure stuff of creation. It's will, that je ne sais quoi, that thing that really can't be fully understood. But when we see its effects, we understand, hey, there's something magical going on here. And that the mortals, or sometimes immortals, who end up casting these spells ultimately are relying on the weaving of certain magical effects together and using the fabric of magic to create these powerful effects in the world. Now, in these worlds, magic is supposedly found just about everywhere, and in the places where it's not, there's some pretty powerful magic to prevent magic from happening, period. So that's another great interesting thing to think about. Kind of a little tidbit for my DMs out there. If there is a place that has no magical capabilities whatsoever, why? What causes that? Might be the premise of an awesome campaign, or side quest, or a major plot story. Who knows? Up to you. Either way, all magic depends on this weave. And there are ultimately two ways of accessing this magical fabric. The first is by arcane methods. This would be the magic of wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, bards, and the other is divine magic. This would be magic that is, maybe borrowed is too strong of a word, but magic that is granted to mortals by deities or super powerful other planar entities, or major celestials or fiends. Either way, the classes that utilize this kind of magic are clerics, rangers, paladins, druids. And without the weave, neither of them, arcane casters or divine magic casters, would be capable of doing so. All that to say, the book is pretty clear that all magic is dependent on this weave, this fabric of magic that exists within the universe itself. How it gets there, we're not ultimately concerned with. We know that it's here, and we're going to use it. Which segues into, how do you use magic? Well, what is magic? Or rather, in this case, what is a spell? A spell is simply this, a discrete magical effect. A single shaping of magical entities of the multiverse into a specific instance and moment, with a generated effect based on how your character understands either the arcane or is prepared and is delivering divine magics into reality. That's a lot of mumbo-jumbo for pretty much saying your character is awesome and has the ability to create magical effects because of their connection to the weave in some way. How we go about understanding a spell, which would be this mote of magic, is defined in several terms, and we'll go through those now. First and foremost, all magic has a spell level, and these levels indicate the power or range of the effects that magic has to offer in D&D. A first level spell like Magic Missile is certainly powerful and has its place, but shudders in the face of 9th level magic, like that of a Wish spell, or calling down a Meteor Swarm. And all of the spells that fall in between these 1st and 9th levels ultimately give us an understanding of the power level accessible to our characters once they access these new areas of magic. How capable your character is when it comes to casting these spells, now, that is all due to the class level that your character is at the present moment. And let me specify, a spell level is not equivalent to a class level. Casters at 9th level are not capable of 9th level spells yet. In fact, one gains access if they are a full spellcaster, so wizard, bard, sorcerer, cleric, druid, that list. Not paladins, rangers, warlocks. The half-casters do not have access to 9th level magics. They top out at 5th level. Characters who can reach that 9th level spellcasting, every odd level, they gain access to a new level of magic. I think we covered this a little bit in a previous video, but I'm going to spell it out a little more plainly here. First level wizards, bards, sorcerers, clerics, and druids have access to first level magic. These are going to be your mage armor, detect magic, magic missile, shield spells, and have plenty of use and are wonderful spells to keep throughout the rest of your campaign. But they're also entry-level spells. This is basic magic, what your character is capable of casting as a first-level adventurer. And when your character reaches 3rd level, now they have access to 2nd level spells. You get 3rd level spells at your class's 5th level, 4th level magic comes at 7th level, 5th level magic comes at 9th level, 6th level magic comes at 11th level, 7th level magic at 13th, 8th level magic at 15th level for your class, and the all-powerful 9th level magic comes at 17th level in your class. And if you remember, you only get 20 levels total, and the vast majority of campaigns do not reach this high tier of play. More often than not, you're going to be capping out probably at 5th or 6th level magic, so ultimately between 9th and 11th level, typically speaking. That's up to your DM. I love a campaign that makes it all the way to level 20, but it's also not that realistic. Most of the time in the game is going to be spent at lower and middle levels. Campaigns that reach that high level, typically speaking, are moving towards the end of the campaign period. Once you're at 20th level, there's not really a whole lot else to accomplish other than killing that final boss, whatever it happens to be. Perhaps a god or a demigod trying to become a god, who knows? Preventing Vecna from doing terrible things to the material plane. It's another Critical Role reference. Sorry, a little addicted here. Either way, spell levels indicate the power at which your magic is cast at. Which brings us to the next point, understanding what magic your character knows and has prepared for the day. Before a spellcaster can bring a spell into existence, that character has to have that spell fixed in their mind, regardless of their class. Preparing your spells is an incredibly important part of your spellcaster's daily routine. The reality is, there is more magic available to your character than what they actively can be ready to cast in a day's adventuring. It's up to you, and what class you've chosen, to prepare yourself for the day what you think you're going to need. Now, this is represented in 2 different ways. Oh, by the way, I'm wearing my Taldore blanket. Thanks, Josh. Buddy, this is such a comfortable blankie. Thank you. Certain classes look at prepared magic as simply learning magic and having it mastered in the back of their minds at all times. This looks primarily like bards, sorcerers, and warlocks. These classes learn spells as they level up and always have access to those spells and can change those spells when they level up, certain intervals within the story, and always have those spells ready to be cast at any given point. They're firmly locked in the back of their mind. Now, if you noticed, all 3 of those classes are charisma-based characters. That's a force of personality character, which means that magic kind of just wells up within them and then comes out, as opposed to a wizard, cleric, or druid who have to spend their time connecting to that magical source. The first group, the charismatic group, kind of have that built-in dwelling magic within them. And the latter group, the wizards, the druids, the clerics, are reliant upon studying or preparing through meditation or prayer, kind of in that order. Wizards study magic in order to bring it into existence. Druids connect with magic and harness the power of the wilderness in order to channel it into reality. And clerics are the physical representation and manifestation of their god's magic in the world. And so, each one has to prepare their spells in the morning. Now, should you not want to, you can certainly just keep your spells from the day prior. But if you know what that day is likely to hold, for instance, you know that you're going to be diving into the dungeon or that a battle is coming, you might change your spells up to make more sense of the day ahead of you. It doesn't make sense to have a whole bunch of travel spells prepared when you know that you're going to need Fireball to take out that horde of goblins on its way. And the opposite is true too. If you know that you're going to be traveling a lot, you might not prepare so many battle spells because hopefully you won't need them for combat, especially once you reach levels that allow you incredibly fast teleportation around the world. Then you can get from safe place to safe place and you don't have to worry about random encounters and things like that. Those monsters you met while traveling, well, they're still out in the wilderness and you zapped from civilization to civilization. That's pretty cool. And you saved yourself a boatload of time doing it. Good for you. Either way, your class description is going to spell out for you how your character goes about preparing your spells. So make sure you're paying attention to that while you're getting ready for your next session. Make sure you've read up on how your wizard goes about preparing their spells every day, or their cleric in their time of meditation and prayer, or the sorcerer in terms of learning a new spell. Maybe they want to unlearn one spell and swap it out for another one while they're gaining a couple other spells. Knowing what your character is capable of is really one of the most important things you can do to benefit your gaming table, yourself, and your DM. Remember, it's up to you to make sure that your character is optimized. Which then brings us to spell slots. Okay, your character has their spells prepared for the day, but what does that mean when it comes to actually casting them? Well, the way that I understand spell slots would be more along the lines of how you go about using your energy to create these magical effects. I'm sure most of you watching have worked a difficult job before when you just feel exhausted at the end of the day. I would imagine that casting magic has a similar toll and effect on your body, and the way that this is best represented would be spell slots. Your character can only cast so much magic before they are physically incapable of doing so anymore, and they have to rest in order to get that magical capability back. So knowing that hopefully will impact how you go about using your spell slots throughout your adventuring day. If you know that you're going to be diving into the dungeon, don't waste your spell slots in town or traveling or at the market unless you absolutely have no choice. Once you're out of spell slots, you're going to have to resort to pretty much using cantrips, which we'll get to in just a second, instead of using your more powerful magics to really control the battlefield. And that's what magic is all about, changing the tides of battle or social interaction in your favor. And your enemies are also going to want to do that for their own favor. So make sure you're using those spell slots wisely. An interesting point, when it comes to understanding how your magic works, you can upcast lower level spells. So say for instance that magic missile spell that we talked about earlier. Normally this spell is a first level spell, and it fires off 3 arcane bolts of energy that are guaranteed to hit the target. This is one of the only spells in the game that has a guaranteed hit rate. You can't miss, unless they cast shield, in which case they block your magic missile. But, I mean, that's still pretty cool as well. It's a wonderful spell. Definitely should think about taking it. But that's beside the point. Magic Missile is great. Guaranteed hit, and each magical ray deals 1d4 plus 1 force damage, which isn't a lot, but it's guaranteed. I think I said that already. Say for instance you need to do more damage than what the first level spell slot would allow. You can choose, if you have the spell slot available, to upcast the spell and increase the amount of arcane bolts you're firing by 1 per spell level. Next thing you know, all of a sudden, your arcane barrage through Magic Missile becomes a lot more powerful at 4th or 5th level than it does at 1st level. But the inverse cannot happen. You cannot downcast a spell. When you read about a spell in the player's handbook or other source book, depending on wherever it is that you're getting your spell information from, the level that's given is the lowest possible level that a spell can be cast at. So for instance, you cannot cast a counter spell, which is a 3rd level spell, at 2nd or 1st level. And most of the time, a spell description is going to tell you how a spell can be enhanced, if at all, by upcasting at a higher level. In certain circumstances, casting a spell at a higher level can also impact how many targets might be impacted by the spell itself. So for instance, the invisibility spell, normally cast at 2nd level, can target one creature and cause them to become invisible for 1 hour, until they attack or cast a spell of their own. But at higher levels cast, you can actually make more creatures invisible than just the one. This can be incredibly helpful depending on the circumstance at which you're using it. But it also means that you're using much higher levels of magic and tiring your character out that much faster in order to achieve your goal. So weigh it all out before you end up deciding that you're going to cast that spell. Whew, well, this is going well. Thanks for stopping by. A quick note as we're getting into this. Armor and magic casting can be a little tricky. If you are wearing armor that you're not proficient in, you cannot cast magic. I do like the way that 5e goes about this. I think this is a lot easier than some of the other versions of D&D that I've either played or read. But I do want to make that clear that when you are wearing armor you've not been trained to wear, you cannot cast magic. So keep that in mind if your wizard, who can't wear any kind of armor normally, decides to put on leather armor or a chain shirt or, God forbid, plate. Holy smokes. The need would have to be incredibly dire to ever think about doing that. But who knows? Maybe the circumstances call for it. However, should your wizard become trained in wearing light armor, they could wear light armor and cast magic. That simple. All right, next up is cantrips. Cantrips are, for the sake of the argument, level 0 spells. They cost you really nothing, and you can cast them indefinitely, over and over and over again without expending your character's magical energy. That's pretty dope. And there are all sorts of cantrips to use depending on the circumstances. There are roleplay cantrips, there are exploration cantrips, there are utility cantrips, and there are damaging cantrips. I would suggest not choosing just one of those types, but trying to get a healthy blend of several different cantrips. Again, they cost your character nothing in terms of magical effort, and can create some really neat little effects. For instance, the mending cantrip. If something non-magical breaks or rips and is within a certain small, like, cubic foot size in damage, you can cast the mending cantrip and repair it. Did your rogue break that lockpick? If he can fish it out, you might be able to put it back together. Maybe. Or did the wheel on your wagon snap while you're adventuring? If you can piece it back together and cast mending on it, you might be able to continue your journey and not have to leave your cart behind. That's pretty beneficial. Or maybe your character likes the message cantrip. You can send a telepathic message up to 120 feet away from you. That's pretty cool. And all you have to do is speak into a wire, a magical walkie-talkie. The neat thing about that spell is whoever you're targeting, they can answer back at the same range. That's pretty cool. Or say you are heading into the dungeon and you are going to need a little bit of light to help you on your way. Either the light cantrip or the dancing lights cantrip can give you a nice visual effect, brightening up that dark, dark dungeon. Hopefully you'll be able to see the traps and monsters that live in there. Or say you end up finding those monsters that live in there and now you have to deal damage to them. You can hit them with fire from a firebolt spell or create bonfire. You can zap them with lightning from the shocking grasp cantrip, blast them with necrotic energy from Toll the Dead or Chilling Touch. There are a lot of really awesome options when it comes to choosing cantrips. My recommendation is when it comes to learning your magical spells, make sure you take one damaging cantrip, one utility cantrip, and, have fun with a third. That way you have a nice even spread. And eventually, as your character levels up, they're going to gain access to more cantrips. Make sure you have 2 different kinds of damages, and try to make it so that one is probably an attack roll and the other a saving throw. That'll come up later. That'll be handy given the circumstances once you start understanding how monsters are either really hard to hit with AC or have really good saving throws. Then you can alternate your spell effects to try and get the most out of your cantrips when it comes to damaging monsters. But that's maybe a little more advanced tactic than what we're looking for right now. But it is my advice, and I'm sticking to it. Cantrips that deal damage do increase the amount of damage they do at certain level intervals, specifically 5th level, 11th level, and 17th level. So they do scale quite nicely as your character goes on. This is meant to represent your character's mastery of such arcane arts, and how they bring about the damaging effects of these cantrips into the world around them. So a firebolt, which would normally deal 1d10, at 5th level now deals 2d10, 3d10 at 11th, and 4d10, yeah, that's 4d10 fire damage at 17th level, which is pretty cool. And it gives you a reason to keep casting cantrips throughout your spellcasting career. All right, I think that's enough on cantrips for now. Let's move on to rituals. Rituals are probably one of my favorite features when it comes to spellcasting routines. Casting a spell as a ritual requires you to add 10 minutes to the casting time. So you're not going to be doing this in the middle of combat. That would be 100 rounds of combat added to the casting of one single spell. This is purely a utility or exploration kind of magic. So detect magic, or identify, or alarm. All of these spells would be first level that you can cast within 6 seconds, but if you spend 10 minutes, they do not cost a spell slot. This can be really useful, particularly the Identify spell, which allows you to understand something about an object, say a magical item, and learn what it does. This also helps reveal certain aspects of items that maybe you didn't know about. Did your rogue friend find a really cool looking dagger in the dungeon? Maybe you should check it and find out what it does and how to use it before you let the rogue just try it out on somebody. You might discover that there's a curse attached to it, and probably could have saved your rogue from a lot of headache. Or not, and have fun with them actually being cursed and, trying to find out how to break that curse. That's part of a fun storyline too. But knowing what a weapon does makes for better combat. Helps you to maximize your party's ability to take down tougher foes. That's a good thing. Also, I should note, because you are casting the spell ritually, you cannot cast it at higher level. It will be cast at the level it's normally cast at. Ritual spells do get a little tricky when it comes to understanding who can cast them and when. Clerics and druids can cast ritual spells, but they do have to have those spells prepared, whereas wizards do not have to have the spell prepared in order to cast it ritually. This is pretty distinct in terms of understanding how your classes can go about casting these ritual spells. Sorcerers can only access the spells that they have learned anyway, so that's kind of a given. They have to know the spell in order to cast it ritually. And there is a pretty awesome feat called Ritual Caster in the PHB, and is worth taking if you don't have a dedicated cleric or wizard in the party, and can give you access to some pretty wonderful spell effects outside of combat. Leoman's Tiny Hut? This brings us to actually casting a spell. What goes into it? Well, some of this will be new information, some of it will be brushing up on what we've already talked about in previous videos. Each spell has a casting time associated to it. For most spells, that's going to be one action. You only get one of those on your turn in combat, but some spells have a casting time of a bonus action. I will note the PHB is very, very clear. You cannot cast a leveled action spell and a leveled bonus action spell. One or the other have to be a cantrip, and more often than not, you have more cantrips that are action spells, not bonus action spells. So, typically speaking, if you're going to be casting a bonus action spell, the only action you'll be able to do on your turn, magically, is a cantrip. Unless you're the sorcerer. Sorcerers can double down on some really neat magical effects using their meta magic feature. If they take the quicken spell meta magic feature, they can take their sorcery points and turn an action spell into a bonus action spell, allowing them to cast a normal action as a bonus action and still cast a cantrip on the same turn. So yes, if you wanted to fireball and firebolt in the same turn, you could. Or if you wanted to create a blade barrier and then gust of wind an enemy into that blade barrier, you could do that too. That's not broken at all. Some food for thought. Cast responsibly. Some spells have the reaction cast time. This does mean that they have to be triggered in a specific way. We talked about the spell Counterspell earlier, and that is a reaction spell that has to be triggered by another spellcaster beginning to cast some sort of action or bonus action spell, at which point you can say, I counterspell! And should the level be right, i.e. a third level spell is countered by a counterspell without a roll required, otherwise you roll the d20 and add your spellcasting modifier, and it has to beat a DC of 10 plus the level of the spell. So a 4th level spell would have a DC of 14, 5th level spell 15, up to 19 with a 9th level spell. So you would have to roll your d20, add your modifier, intelligence for a wizard, wisdom for a cleric, and so on and so forth. And if you beat the DC, that spell does not get cast. You can upcast Counterspell to match the same level of the spell being cast, and you do not have to make a roll. This is an incredibly clutch moment in a big fight, and can often turn the tide of battle. So again, make sure you are saving your spell slots for when it really counts. Your party will thank you. Your DM might hate you, but no, they won't hate you. They'll be impressed too. But back to the point, certain spells that have a reaction spell casting time do require a certain thing to have happened to that character. The other one that comes to mind is the shield spell, which does mean you have to be attacked by something, either a melee weapon, a ranged weapon, or some sort of spell effect like magic missile, after which you can cast your shield and hopefully deflect the attack and prevent other attacks from hitting you for the rest of the turn. Seriously, amazing spell. Go check it out. And lastly, there are certain spells that have longer cast times than an action. Some take a minute to cast. Others can take up to an hour or even 24 hours to cast. These are interesting because you have to maintain concentration on them the entire time you're casting this spell. Should your concentration break, the spell fades. But I will also note, the PHB does specify that should this happen, it does not consume a spell slot. I didn't know that until I was reading and researching for this episode. I learned something too. Thank you. Next up is range. The range of a spell, as it's laid out in the description of the spell, tells you how far away you have to be from a target in order to enact the spell and cause it to have effect on something. This also has everything to do with who the target of the spell would be. So again, Magic Missile would have the target of a creature, but the shield spell is only for you, or self, as the spell description so lovingly puts it. You can't shield an ally, you can only shield yourself. Typically speaking, you would see one of three things. A number in terms of how far away in feet you'd have to be from a character in order to cast that spell, i.e. a ranged spell effect. A touch effect spell, which means you have to physically lay your hands on that person, or the self range, which literally just means only you can apply this spell to yourself. So Mage Armor, which is a magical kind of armor that affects your AC, you can give to another person, and it is not concentration. Whereas Shield only applies to you in that circumstance, and only lasts for the duration of the round after you've cast it. Whereas Mage Armor lasts for 8 hours. Mage Armor is so good. Another fun note, once a spell is cast, the range itself is not affected unless the spell specifies otherwise. So unless the spell says you must maintain that range in order for it to stay in effect, you can go outside of that range and still concentrate on that spell, should it have a longer duration than instantaneous. But we'll get to duration in just a second. Next up are components. That's right, in order to bring magic into existence, you have to do certain things, there are 3 categories, in order to bring about the effect of the spell. The 3 components are V, S, and M. V stands for verbal. This means that your character has to be able to speak in order to bring that effect into existence, which means if they find themselves in a place of magical silence, they are incapable of casting spells that have a verbal component. So let that rattle your think noodle for a little bit. If you know an enemy caster to be in an area, create a silence effect in there and force them to come outside of that range or cover that they might have in order to cast spells, revealing them and hopefully giving your party a shot to take them down before they can wreck you with their own magics. This is Magical Tactics with SpartanBodie. Again, you're welcome. Next up is the S, or somatic. Somatic, not semantic, as I've heard a lot of people say. I'm actually getting into semantics, trying to tell you that it's not semantic. Either way, somatic. This means motion, movement. There are certain things you would have to do with hand signals, or a wand, or maybe the sweep of your arm. Who knows? The book doesn't really specify. Those things are usually left to the creative mind of the spellcaster. If you want to embellish, go ahead. Have a little fun. Make it flair. But please, it's somatic, not semantic. And lastly, M, which stands for material. Certain materials just have magical essence to them. Even though this spell is completely trash, in my opinion, the Witch Bolt spell has one of my favorite spell components. A twig from a tree that has been struck by lightning. In order to cast that spell, you have to have a twig from a tree that's been struck by lightning. That's so cool. And if the spell were any good, think about how exciting that would be to be in the middle of a thunderstorm, knowing that you want to cast that spell and just waiting for a tree to get struck. That creates some fun moments. Which brings us to the two categorizations of material components. On the one hand, you can go the route of a component pouch, which would be actually gathering all of the materials that the spell specifies you would need. So if you're going to cast the Fireball spell, for instance, you would have to have bat guano. Yeah, it's bat poop. Yeah. Gross, right? If you desire to end them in one fell swoop, you must acquire nasty bat poop. If it rhymes, it must be true, right? Either way, this can be really fun in terms of how your character spends their time gathering these components. And once they have them, unless the spell says that it consumes them in the casting of the spell, you're good to go. You've got it from that point forward. Now, if this isn't interesting to you and just feels like micromanaging, then, my friend, you need an arcane focus. An arcane spellcasting focus could be a magical gemstone, or an orb, or a wand. Maybe it's a staff. Either way, that replaces the material components necessary to cast the spell, with one exception. Any spell that has a material component that has a gold value attached to it, this would be attached to the spell itself in the description, must be present for that spell to take place. So for instance, if one of your teammates unfortunately passes in a fight, and you wish to revivify them before their soul completely leaves their body, you must have 300 gold pieces worth of diamonds. And in this case, the diamonds are consumed with the casting of the spell. Now granted, this is to save your friend's life, so it's well worth it in the moment, but you will have to recover those by means of purchasing them or finding them in other places. And if your cleric is out of diamonds, I'm sorry, you're out of luck. And you're probably going to have to get more to cast higher level magic like Raise Dead, or Resurrection, or True Resurrection, in order to bring them back. Now don't be discouraged, that's going to be a really, really fun story arc, and getting your friend back is going to be very worthwhile and feel very rewarding in that moment. Trust me. Been there myself. So ultimately, the component pouch or arcane focus, it's really just there for any kind of flair or extra gimmick that you're looking to spice up how you describe your character casting a spell, unless it has a gold requirement for that component. Then you have to have that present. That's about it as far as components go. Next up, we have duration. There are two ways of understanding the duration of a spell. It is either instantaneous, meaning it takes place immediately and then passes as quickly as it comes, or it requires concentration. We've talked about concentration before, and this has everything to do with your character's constitution. A concentration check is all about how your character can maintain their focus on a spell to elongate its duration past that instantaneous moment, if applicable. So let's say that you are wanting to buff one of your teammates and you give them the benefits of the haste spell. You can do this for up to 1 minute, which is 10 rounds of combat, in which their speed is doubled, they get an extra action which can be used for certain specific things, for instance, 1 weapon attack, not their full attack action, 1 item usage, so a potion drinking or something along those lines, or another dash, so that's a lot of movement for sure, and also increases their AC by 2 while you have this spell in effect. Should an enemy take note of this, they might not like that your barbarian or fighter is getting all this extra power from this spell effect, and they might target you to try and break your concentration. Concentration is broken in the following 3 ways. First and foremost, if you cast another spell with the concentration tag, you lose concentration on the first. That's just it. If the spell does not have the concentration tag, flag, then no, it doesn't break your concentration, and you can continue casting magic. So on the next turn, if you maintain your concentration, you can cast Fireball and let your teammate still have the haste effect on them. That's super cool. But should you cast invisibility on yourself, your hasted friend will not have the haste effect on them any longer, and instead, you will be invisible, now concentrating on that spell effect instead. The second thing is taking damage. We've talked about this when it comes to HP and Constitution saving throws, but in the event that you are concentrating on a spell and you take damage, you need to make a concentration check with a DC of 10 or half the damage that you took from the attack, whichever is higher. So if you make the Constitution saving throw, you maintain the concentration on the effect. If not, the pain is too great and your character loses concentration. Or thirdly, your character is incapacitated or killed outright. This is kind of rare, but in the event that your character does become incapacitated, any spell that they were concentrating on is lost. So say for instance you have Mage Armor on, and you are incapacitated or unconscious or killed. That spell does still affect you until it runs out of its duration, whether or not you are dead. Interesting note. So if you are brought back, that spell does still remain in effect. However, an invisibility spell would fade as soon as your character is incapacitated or unconscious or killed outright, which actually is to your benefit. If you're invisible still and your party can't see you to heal you, that's kind of some bad news. So in that case, I'm kind of thankful for that. But this might have some consequences in the case that your character has the, I don't know, fly spell on them. And if they were to lose concentration, all of a sudden they're not flying anymore and are falling really, really fast to potential death and hazard. You know, food for thought. So concentration is very important. Another reason that a concentration spell might fail is that it's dispelled, but that's not breaking your concentration. That's the magical effect being nullified by another caster deciding they don't want your magic to exist anymore. So it doesn't really violate the rule of 3 there. All right, next up we move on to targets. If the spell targets a creature and not an area, you must have a field of vision towards that creature. You can't cast a spell on a target that you can't see. Now, if the spell range targets an area, every creature within that area has to make a save against the effect. But a creature that is fully hidden or behind total cover is not affected by a spell that targets a single creature. So make sure you're taking note of that. But the PHB does specify this is only total cover, not 3/4 or 1/2. And when it comes to understanding what you can target with a spell, targeting yourself is pretty much always an option unless the spell states otherwise. Should a spell state that you can only target a hostile creature or a creature other than yourself, then you could consider casting a spell on you. So if you want to haste yourself or go invisible, you have that option. But you couldn't cast Crown of Madness on yourself, which is really, that'll mess with your head a little bit. Let's continue the pace. Areas of effect. Certain spells might just have a single target, which, okay, that's fine, but some spells actually affect an area of the battle map. And what that area looks like is also defined in the spell description as it's laid out in the PHB, or other source depending on where you're at for your spells. There are 5 area of effect descriptions in terms of how a spell can be applied. The first is the cone. Now, I will say this isn't just for magic, but certain magical effects also can benefit from these different ranges or areas of effect. So for instance, yes, casting the Cone of Cold spell is a cone effect. It's kind of right there in the name. A red dragon's fire breath also is a magical cone effect. Second is a cube. Now, make sure that you're understanding cube does take into consideration height as well as length and width. So cubes can be useful for hitting flying enemies as well, or flying allies. Be careful there. Cylinders. This one is going to incorporate a lot more the height understanding of a spell. So if you have creatures that are flying, cylinder effects are pretty dope. A line effect, which means you have to have a direct line to the target. Some dragon breaths also have the line as their area of effect. And lastly, the sphere. Spheres are all about volume. So we're going to be taking into consideration a lot of the 3-dimensional understandings of an area. Fireball is a sphere effect, and typically where you detonate it, any creature that is within the sphere, even if they have cover around them, that whole area is engulfed in a flaming explosion. So really nothing gets a whole lot of advantage or save benefits from that, unless that creature specifically has those as part of their natural resistance. Which brings me to the last part of understanding spellcasting in D&D. And I think we've covered most of these things already, so this is just a little bit of brief recap for you. When it comes to casting a spell, you're going to have one of 2 ways of actually getting that spell effect to take place. There's either going to be an attack roll associated with it, where you roll the d20 and add your spellcasting modifier plus your proficiency, or the enemy is going to need to make a saving throw against it. And how you come to your difficulty class for your saving throw is a base of 8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus. And if they roll below your DC, they fail the save and take the full effect effect of the spell. But if they match your number or exceed it, then they save and either take half damage or no effect of the spell whatsoever. All of that is going to be found in the description of the spell. And the final note when it comes to spellcasting, at least as this chapter goes through and talks about it, is that you can't double magical effects, or at least you can't double magical effects of the same name. So let's say that, for instance, your party has 2 clerics, and one of them decides to cast Bless. This benefits 3 party members. They now get to add a d4 to all of their attack rolls and saving throws for the duration of this concentration spell. The other cleric says, that's actually really helpful right now. I'm going to do that too. The second cleric cannot target a creature that already has the Bless effect in order to give them a double Bless. It's still only going to be 1d4, even if they've targeted that character to receive another blessing. So in this case, make sure that you're sharing the wealth of magic with your party. Any spell effect cannot be duplicated if it is already on your person. So if you have the haste effect on you from a magical item or something that innately gives it to you, your wizard also can't give you haste. You don't get the double effect there. But maybe they can cast Enlarge or Reduce, and now you're hasted and twice your size. That's terrifying and really awesome. That's going to be a story we talk about for years to come. I'm sure of it. You can continue to stack on magical effects, they just can't be the same effect over and over again. You only get the benefit of one of those sources at a time. Ooh, yeah, I think that's everything as far as spellcasting goes. Hopefully that wasn't so much drinking from a fire hose as it might have been. I'm sorry about that. Magic at first was kind of intimidating for me, but once you sit down, and really this chapter is like 5 pages, it's not that long, and the rules are very straightforward. I think you'll be all right, and I believe in you. Hey, friend, this is the end of the video. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm excited for the Session 3 recap that'll be next Tuesday, and that's also the day that our Discord server is going live. So thank you so much, and in the meantime, adventure's calling. Are you listening?